Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Legaltech Around the World series for our very last session of this year. We're going to share what we've learnt over the past year and a bit. And, of course, as you know, this session is titled Big Themes and Big Changes. And we're going to discuss those as they emerged from our global discussions. I want to kick off by thanking David Bushby, who is the Managing Director of In Council and In Council 2, for being such amazing collaboration partners on this series. And of course, David's exceptional facilitation on hosting the series too. It's kind of fun for me to be able to flip the card on David today and ask him lots of questions. He, of course, is joined by the always amazing Nikki Shaver, who is the CEO of Legaltech Hub, which she runs with her co-founder, Haroon Klink. And Clinton Swan. Clinton is the co-founder of Codelex Legal Tech and a consultant with regulation. It's an amazing panel of folks for us to be able to chat about all of these things with. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome all of you. In fact, welcome back. It's great to see all of you.
Thanks, Terri.
So I thought I'd kick us off with the first question to you, David. You chatted with a lot of people. Believe it or not, it was 7 regions and 19 countries. And so I guess, this is a huge question to ask you, but reflecting on that, did anything kind of shake out as a definition of what a legal tech ecosystem is, or I guess isn't for that matter?
Yeah, thanks, Terri. It was a question I guess we asked across all of the panels right across the world. It was one of the early questions, which was, what makes up the legal tech ecosystem in each of their respective jurisdictions. And I tried to kind of pull that together and categorize what we can define in the ecosystem into maybe 6 broad categories, I think. And the first would probably be the sellers. So the legal tech companies and the founders, those that have, bet on new business models or new technologies and trying to reshape legal services market. So on the seller side, that's the legal tech companies themselves. And then we've, of course, got the buyers. And I don't just mean sort of customers in general, but those customers are starting to or have, formed their own kind of titles or, communities. So it's your heads of innovations of large law firms as a buyer segment. Or even the heads of innovation or legal operations folks in the in-house environment, again, who are coming together as groups of buyers with buying power and are able to educate the market. So buyers and sellers. On the money side, we've got the funders. So those are the seed or angel investors, the VCs, and in some cases, legal-specific venture capital outfits that are able to fund these startup ventures in legal tech. We've also got the advisors that are there. So I can sort of break that down into your incubators or accelerators, probably dominated by law firm-backed accelerators that are springing up around the world. And also consultants and to some extent publishers as well that are putting out content who are able to advise the ecosystem on what's new and what's happening. The 5th segment would be what I've kind of called educators and communities. So these are your peak bodies in different jurisdictions. Not all jurisdictions have them. I actually probably thought there'd be more peak body for legal tech in each different country, through to your meetup groups that are happening or sort of sprouted up around the world. Legal education companies, of course, like the College of Law, Terri, doing an amazing job on educating and building community, as well as the publishers themselves who put on events or even legal tech specific event companies as well. And of course, we can't miss out on the universities doing their fair share of educating the legal tech ecosystem. And finally, I put down the regulators as well, who are helping shape the legal tech ecosystem. Some for better, some for worse, more progressive than others, etc. And then even in some jurisdictions, parts of the regulatory framework that are dedicated specifically to advancing legal technology in their jurisdiction. So that's kind of how it seemed to shake out in all the jurisdictions that we saw.
Yeah, and that was pretty consistent, I think, as you say, some in different places and others, but that they were kind of fairly consistent, do you think?
I thought there was probably in the peak bodies. Like I was surprised. I just thought there would be a peak body that we weren't aware of in certain countries. In Australia, you've got the Australian Legal Technology Association, quite clearly a peak body, and other countries have that very well recognised peak body. And I just expected maybe more of that across the different countries, but a lot of them just didn't have that formalised structure or a collective of the startups, it might be, or the people in their ecosystem. So that was a bit of a change. And we'll probably talk about this a lot in the US, like it just has this ecosystem at a very mature rate, and probably parts of Europe, or in particular the UK, again, really advanced on all 6 of these areas. Maybe in the US, the regulatory side is probably less advanced compared to other parts of the world, or less progressive. So a couple of differences there.
Yeah, absolutely. But lots of opportunities really out of that as well, in terms of work that folks can do in their respective regions and countries. I wanted to stay with you for a sec, David, and just, again, this is another very broad kind of overarching question. But if we take a bit of a temperature check, I guess, on legal tech globally, what mode do you think we're in at the moment? And by that, I'm being very simplistic in the terminology here. So I'm thinking, startup, scale up, something entirely different, or it doesn't matter, whichever way you want to start. And I'll kick off with you. And then, Nikki, I'm going to bring you in on that one as well, if I may.
Yeah, Terri, I like the question, and I like the sort of the startup versus scale up kind of terminology there. And if we looked at what the difference between, say, a startup and a scale up might be, so maybe looking at scale up, so that's defined by growth. That's maybe the key metric. So a legal tech company that is in growth stage, it's experienced consecutive 2 to 3 years of high rates of growth, year on year, 20, 30% year on year type of growth. They're at the funding stage, which is beyond seed. It's more Series A and above. So already attracted decent amounts of capital in order to scale. And speaking of scale, there does need to be a certain scale. So whether that's an employee count of 20, 30, 40, 50 employees, that's sort of where I think if we kind of define scale-ups, that's what we could be looking at. And across the world, in the different legal tech categories, be that lawyer marketplaces or e-discovery or CLM or AI contract review tools, etc., I think there is a fair or substantial representation of scale-up companies, or companies that are at that scale-up stage across the world in each of the major legal tech categories. So yes, I would sort of characterize legal tech globally in the scale-up mode, and probably to exclude some of the more very well-established players that are no longer in scale-up. They're more at the value stage of the cycle. But for the modern era of legal tech, I would characterize scale up would be where we're at.
Yeah, fantastic. And Nikki, I know that you're looking at this a lot with the work that you're doing through Legal Tech Hub. So similar thoughts about that, different?
Yeah, I think I think it's actually quite difficult to answer this question for the world at large. As
we try with some difficult ones,
As we've seen from throughout the course of this excellent series, I think it really varies from region to region. So in the US, we're certainly in scale-up mode. We're almost a step beyond that. I don't think that means maturity. So I actually don't think that we could call any legal technology market globally mature yet. A mature market is one where we have seen not just scaled up companies, but also sufficient consolidation in the market that it's very clear who the entrenched leading players are in each category. We are not there yet. There are very few categories of legal technology where it's clear to say that there has been enough consolidation and enough movement that we know exactly who the leading players are. They're well established. We are still getting a lot of new startups, and the market is still very fragmented. So I would say even in a market that is quite mature, like the US, it's not mature as compared to broad tech markets. But I would say in the US, we had a huge explosion of growth in 2017, say, where just the number of startups founded each year was extraordinary. That has declined steadily. And where we are at now is more in a place where people are doing the hard work of really building and understanding how to use and get the benefit out of these solutions. So I would say we're kind of in genuine sort of build and value mode. I think the UK is similar to that. Then you have regions like Africa as a continent, I think, is still in sort of A2J, just turning to the commercial solutions. So very much in early startup mode. I think in Latin America, you have some countries that are in sort of the mid years of startup. The kind of boom that we saw in the US in 2017 is probably happening in Latin America now. And then they're emerging into scale up. So they're a bit more mature. There are places in Europe like the Nordic region, which is, again, full sort of startup boom at the moment, a ton of activity with the beginnings of scaling up. And I think places like Asia and Singapore in particular, we're still seeing more earlier stage startup, but getting traction and moving towards that boom where you're seeing a few scale up companies emerge. So I do think it varies quite significantly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
And I want to get into some of the reasons for that too, by the way. But Clinton, just on Nikki's comment on Asia, what do you have kind of thoughts about Asia and what that's looking like as well, or in addition to that?
Yeah, there's a bunch of very different places across the region. I was just going to add in a thought that came to mind as Nikki was speaking. I mean, thinking of the lenses, if you like, that David mentioned, the different types. All of those lenses are at different stages as well. So, with corporate legal, it's primarily looking at, operational efficiency is the focus. It hasn't quite yet moved to, the behavioural underpinnings of the company like that sort of thing. Asia generally, really mixed bag. One end of the spectrum, you've got Singapore, where you've had, a government investment and support into the ecosystem, that being manifested through, Ministry of Law looking at underlying data and processes, the Singapore Academy of Law with the programs that they've run, and along the way that's evolved as well. So it's started to be more of a look at, okay, we've put all these things in place, and we're brought in consulting, we're brought in funding. Where to from here? Where's the return? And so you're seeing at the moment the next layer of attention being paid. And I think this maybe this is something that maybe David, you're going to touch on a bit later on around the education piece. I mean, you're seeing that come into play in Singapore as well, feeding the market with talent, that sort of thing. So yeah, Singapore at one end of the scale, and then you still have other jurisdictions. I would say Malaysia is probably a relatively good example where there's still uncertainty in the market. Can people operate? Can they not? The Bar Council tends to be conservative in their view of what legal tech is, what's permitted. If it helps a lawyer do their job, then that's fine. If it's something that interfaces with the market, then that's not so fine. So yes, you've got a real range across the region jurisdiction.
Yeah, thanks. With all of that being said, I guess, and I've got to go there because I know this is going to be a question that people will want answered. What's hot in legal tech right now? And what I mean by that is, as I say, given all that you've said, where's the money being channeled? Where is it going, and why is it going there? I guess is the other part of that question. And Nikki, I want to, if I can, kick that off with you.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, Terri, because I don't think that where the money is being spent is where it is hot right now. I think we're seeing too much money being funneled into certain categories, and I think we're going to see some crashes. So CLM is one area where there's been just enormous amounts of investment beyond what is reasonable, valuations that are too high for the market. So that I think is interesting from a money perspective. What I think is hot right now, some very interesting new types of solutions. So smart drafting is one, because we're seeing much better AI in legal. As we all know, when AI first entered legal, it wasn't really AI, it was machine learning and natural language processing. And more than that, it was those types of technologies at a less advanced stage than many other industries were already using them. We're now at a point where we actually have quite sophisticated machine learning, natural language processing in legal. We're also seeing neural networks underpinning solutions in legal. So I think some of the neural network search platforms that we have coming out, the ability to extract clauses on the fly as you're drafting a document in order to surface it to lawyers in real time, solutions that use AI in order to push knowledge to lawyers in time. So as you're drafting an email saying, can you send me the latest subscription agreement, that information can be pushed to them, which has kind of been the holy grail of KM and innovation teams for years. And I think compare, which we all forget, when redlining first came out, that was a pretty phenomenal achievement. And now you're able to compare documents at scale. So not just one document against another, but one document against multiple documents to see where the differences are and to identify what is most similar to the document you're looking at, which is very powerful for a number of different use cases in law. So I actually think there's some really cool, new, exciting stuff out there, largely because of the technology advances that we've seen recently.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think the work that's being done in contracting, to use that very broadly, is absolutely game changing. And we will look back on this, I think, in a very short period of time, and just be absolutely blown away by how that has changed the way we conceive work in law, much less do it or deliver it. I think it's just going to be absolutely phenomenal. And on that note, David, no pressure. What do you think is kind of hot out there?
Oh, not a whole lot of pressure, because I'd really echo what he said. If the CLM space, there was a point last year where there was about 7 consecutive months where a CLM player had significant funding thrown their way. It was just crazy. Yeah, every month there was a new one that had been announced. So CLM, I think, is certainly hot from a funding perspective. I also feel like it's quite hot in terms of interest as well. And I don't see that dying off for the rest of this year and into 2023. I think it will remain hot for a while. Over the years, featuring the startups in Law Hackers, I've typically at the end of the year kind of looked at the click-through rates on those newsletters each week, and factoring in for open rates, etc. Featured what are the top 10 that people seem to be clicking on. And year after year, it was the companies that dealt with drafting, not necessarily contracts, but drafting tools. And that includes contracts, includes CLM, but it also includes the AI that helps you draft, or it helps you collect knowledge. So to do with authoring, those were the tools consistently for a few years running. And I think that stays the same, that attract the most attention. And again, I probably also agree with Nikki, the advances in AI that helps lawyers and even non-lawyers do the drafting of contracts. Seeing some of the auto markup tools and come into market, it's only going to get better. It's not going to get worse. And the ability for people that are not lawyers to draft up documents according to playbooks using artificial intelligence, I think, is really exciting and really opens up the world of lawyering beyond the legal practitioner.
And I know we'll get into this a bit later, but also as perhaps regulations become more supportive of allied professionals becoming or playing a larger part in the provision of services and products, I can see the sort of things that you and Nikki were just talking about, the sort of tools, as being tremendously helpful and useful there too. We've spoken about, in some respects, kind of the industry and how it's, I guess, really coming into its own in many respects, but there's also been challenges, and we all kind of recognise those. So I wanted to ask you, and David, if you can kick us off again here. What do you think, or what did you find the biggest challenges that were enumerated were, particularly for legal tech development around the world?
Well, one of the challenges, which is probably going to get more acute, and I can't help but keep returning to the funding environment. So,
Yeah.
of course, the last 12 to 18 months was particularly frothy for tech in general, and then legal tech being no exception. So a lot of money raised at very high valuations. So we've seen the drop off from that level of funding already. And I think that will continue in this type of recessionary outlook in the US, Europe, and many parts of the world. And I don't think we can really escape from that. I just think from a recessionary perspective, it feels like we're heading towards that. US has already seen a couple of negative GDP quarters, which was typically the kind of definition for recession, but with employment or unemployment being historically low, we can't really call the recession just yet. But I do think it is the next 12 to 18 months will be harder to raise funds, harder again to raise funds at the same valuation as what we're given in the last 12 to 18 months. So funding's never easy, and in particular in some of the more developing jurisdictions around the world where there's just not as much interest in legal tech. One jurisdiction such as Brazil, for example, massive market opportunity, but in terms of its investability as a country, it's not as a safe jurisdiction to invest. So there are challenges around the world anyway with funding, but I think probably the big theme in the near term will be the recessionary outlook and the existing tech kind of downturn led by the US.
David, let me ask you this follow-up question, and it's kind of going back to what we were discussing before. But in terms of the shape of the industry, if there's not the money around, does the ideas will still be around? So will that make us look now more like startups than scale-ups, because there won't be the money to invest to get it beyond that, or will it be a damping down in a way of the whole kind of legal tech industry? So I'm just trying to get an idea of, as if the money is tougher, what's the impact on the legal tech development sector?
I think it'd be probably more the dampening down, Terri. I think it's a scale up that doesn't achieve or doesn't raise its next round, probably doesn't suddenly revert back to startup mode. It probably goes away if it can't raise funds and that type of thing. So more of a dampening down, I would have thought, Terri, in this environment. But it's not limited to the legal tech whatsoever. It's a general dampening down across the sector. But and we might get into it a bit later. I also see there's opportunity from every downturn as well. But that's my broad view there.
If I could just jump in there,
please. Yeah.
My business partner Jeroen talks about startups and says, you can split them up into the startup and how well it's doing in addressing the problem it's trying to solve. With, say, a type startup, there might be one problem with it. With a B startup, there might be 2 or 3 problems with it. With a C startup, there might be 3 to 5 problems with it. A startups, so they're doing really well at addressing a particular problem. They're high quality. They are still getting funded today, and we think that might continue because the legal market is a different type of market in a lot of ways, and some of the funding there is likely to stick around even with a recession or an economic downturn. So I think it's not all bad news, but I do think funders will be much pickier about which startups they choose.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting at. There's still going to be the activity there has to be, right? People still have ideas and want to do something with them. So, a great point there. Nikki, if I can come to you, and I just want to stay in the challenges space, because I think that it can be actually quite helpful and instructive in terms of the folks that are listening to this. The biggest challenge that you're seeing for legal tech around the world, the development?
So, I mean, certainly one of the challenges is the regulation of the law generally, and the way that limits the impact of technology. I think that in certain jurisdictions that can be very difficult, even in the US, which, as you actually foreshadowed earlier, Terri, is quite a mature market, but there is a limit to the extent to which tech companies can, there's that line between what is legal information and what is legal advice. And that is a heavily regulated line in the US with, a prohibition against non-lawyer ownership of law firms, which we've seen change in Utah and Arizona. But California has just recently come back and said, we double down on that rule, in spite of the fact that, they say they encourage and embrace innovation. The ABA has come down and said, we stand behind the non-lawyer ownership rule, which is challenging because you have companies that are trying to do things in really interesting ways, different types of firms that are trying to put tech forward, but are restricted from doing so in the same way. And I think in other areas as well, where it's a really heavily regulated profession, that is one of the things that can prevent the kind of scale up type maturity of legal tech development that we are seeing in other areas.
And Nikki, sorry to ask a question here, Terri, but because California itself is just such a massive market for legal tech, and so this development I think is really important. Was there something that changed the regulator's mind? Were there events? Were there reasons? Did the tide suddenly turn, or was it always heading this way?
It's really interesting. There were huge activist bodies in California really advocating for change. But whenever you have that type of activity, you also have, the stalwarts on the other side, and they just ended up having a stronger voice. And it is a very kind of protectionist, almost guild society here. And unfortunately, I think that's what stood strong in the face of the activism. I don't think that's finished. I think that conversation will continue, but it certainly is a significant blow after what we've seen as quite positive and progressive activity over the last few years.
And I think particularly because the sorts of tools that could be used, should the regulations not prevent them being used by certain people. And the comment I think that's been resonating in California has been that particularly to the B2C market, it just made the availability of legal services and products so much broader and wider. And that's now been limited again. So, a really big impact. And thanks for that, Nikki. It's a great kind of overview.
Terri, sorry, just to very quickly jump in on that. You're right. And I think it's worth articulating. It has been again and again shown and recently confirmed that something like it's over 90% of legal needs of people below the poverty line in the US go unmet. And that this would be addressed, this specific gap would be addressed if non-lawyer ownership of firms could be eased and the regulation could be changed. So it's a really disappointing outcome because there is such an extreme need for all kinds of different methods of addressing legal needs in this country. I just think it's worth stressing that it is very unfortunate.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, that percentage isn't a lot better pretty much anywhere you go around the world. So, the need is global in terms of considering these sort of things really thoughtfully and acting on them. let me go positive now. Okay, I promised. Here we are. Biggest opportunities, yay, for legal tech globally. David, let me kick off with you.
I'll just drill into one point that was mentioned as we went around the world. We're talking about how big the ecosystem is, et cetera, and we're talking about the markets, how big markets were in different jurisdictions. And one that stood out to me was Brazil. It was a relatively recent jurisdiction we visited, so it sort of stands out in my mind because we just talked about it. But massive legal market there, and and a smaller group of companies who are in the legal tech space, and that was the one I'd referred to earlier, where the market is big enough to sustain a very large business and successful business, but from an investment perspective, it's seen as a less desirable jurisdiction to park your money. It's a riskier environment, but it just really felt like Brazil, maybe even LATAM, as being huge markets that for the braver people out there, it could be a really great market to tap into. I also think of Japan a little bit standing out. Again, massive legal market, but very conservative, probably the most conservative of all of the countries that we sort of visited or talked about. I think Maurice had talked about practices such as pen and paper being really prevalent in areas that we take for granted now are digitized in our processes. Maybe it's still too early, or maybe it's the right time for Japan, but again, it sort of stands out as massive market ready for disruption, but massive market that ought to be having some disruptive forces, but maybe it's not ready just yet. But there were a couple of challenges from if you're looking around the world in legal tech, where could you go? They'd be worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. Nikki, biggest opportunities for legal tech globally?
Ooh, big question.
It is a very big question. Yeah.
I do think some of the things that are exciting that I'm seeing happen globally currently are standardization, some standardization of documents, but I have to say, unfortunately, I'm a bit of a pessimist about the potential for standard document initiatives to really disrupt the way law firms work at a certain level. I think they have the power to disrupt and also empower smaller players in the market, and that's really exciting. Like the One NDA project, I think, is a fantastic project, and it should change the way many people work in respect of NDAs. I also think the SALI Alliance is really exciting, and that's taking it to a different level. That's standardization of data. And I think that has huge potential to disrupt, because once we start looking at standard practice areas and standard matter types so that we're able to compare apples to apples across firms, it's bringing much greater transparency to clients. And that transparency, which is actually something that happened in Brazil, clients collectively got together and really activated for firms to bill differently and to charge differently for legal work. I think if we start having that transparency on the client side as to really how the fees break down from firm to firm, it will force firms to increase their competitiveness from different angles. So if you can't charge, X for this type of work because everyone will be able to see that it's 30% more than everybody else, unless you are a particular firm that goes by reputation alone, you're going to be forced to actually undertake that work in a different way. And I think that could supercharge legal technology in the way that it's actually used in practice and legal practice, because then that becomes a real competitive edge. So that to me is quite exciting. I think we're a long way away from that, but I think we could get there. I also think, one of the things about law, of course, is that it is jurisdictionally bound. And what that means is if you are a lawyer, it's quite difficult to move from one jurisdiction to another. So I think it's very exciting with legal technology that if you're if we take a step back from the actual tech and look at the people side of it, this is a field that enables people to travel from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and take up jobs in other places, because the expertise that you need in order to work in legal tech and legal innovation is much more transferable than straight law. And that to me is exciting, because there are all these new jobs in law and all these new skills that are necessary. So I think there's great opportunity in just the people side of the legal profession, and what is opening up to students now coming out of law school, which is ironically exactly the opposite of what they think that is happening. They think, AI is coming and there will be fewer jobs in law. I actually think there'll be more jobs in law.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think implicit in what you were saying with the tech is borderless notion kind of hanging out there, it is just the opportunity for collaboration, and the skills thing, just so important. I know that in different parts of the world, and I'm sure David will bear this out as well in terms of the series, there were real skills shortages. But as you say, there doesn't have to be if you know where to source people and basically be able to connect with them. So really, really great points there. I want to jump into the next question and come to you first on this one, if I may, Clinton. And that's around this question of digital literacy. And I know we can argue about terminology, so I'm just going to keep that fairly broad and define it as being really the ability to use the sorts of tools that we've been speaking about. So, as I say, quite a simplistic definition. So in some cases, to go to the skills point, there's lots of it. In some cases, there's not so much of it. But in terms of how that plays a part in legal tech uptake, how's that being overcome? And Clinton, I want to ask about how that's been approached in Singapore, because I think that was quite a unique situation.
And obviously, look, each jurisdiction has its own unique set of components. And Singapore is quite a unique one. We've got, relatively, we've got a small land mass contained group of people. It's a hub for the region, regulatory, financial, legal, in a lot of ways. And because of the way it's set up, the government's been able to approach things from a number of angles. Sorry, when I say the government, Singapore, if you like. And those angles have included, bringing in consultancies over a couple of years with a program to take particularly smaller firms through a process of digitization, education, that sort of thing. There's been a corresponding funding approach. So again, this is going back a couple of years, but feeding into the overall build. There's also been another stream of activity, which is underlying data and processes of courts and things like that. At the education end of things, as we're touching on here, you've got places like, quite aside from the in-industry education, which rumbles on as it does, I think, in most jurisdictions, whether that's enthusiasts or whether it's communities or driven top-down or whatever. You've also got places like, I think it's the SMU, with putting in place a computational law program, where you're getting, I don't know if they've had the first couple of graduate yet, but looking at feeding into the market, saying, right, one of the things that's needed to move legal tech forward is that resource. Singapore's very intent on developing, I guess, sort of tech hub status as well. So they're looking to feed in from that end of the market.
There was a fair bit of, if I'm remembering this correctly, financial support for law firms in terms of their uptake of legal tech as well, right? Or their legal tech adoption.
There was a program, I'm not sure if it still continues at the moment, but there was a program, certainly at least for a year, perhaps 2 years, where firms could recoup something along the lines of, it might have been 70% of costs involved with putting technology in. And there was a short list of products and technologies which ticked the boxes for that. But I mean that level of government support for essentially a private sector industry is quite staggering in the context of
yes. Yeah, it did kind of stand out. Thanks for that in that respect. David, I want to pick up on the point that has been made earlier, and that's around, I guess, the role of law schools, but more broadly, education programs around digital literacy. And there was quite a bit of chat about that in terms of the various places that we visited. In terms of the digital literacy part and connecting it with education, what are your thoughts about the part that it's playing in legal tech uptake in various places?
Yeah, it certainly plays a very strong part. It was a fairly strong theme, I think, through the jurisdictions that we visited. I think most did have, it was fairly common for law schools, universities to have a component of legal tech or innovation taught at the law school level. I haven't broadly done sort of a sense check across the world around what proportion of law schools have that in their programs, but it does feel like in our little world that there are a lot. Certainly in Australia, the law schools here have got those programs in place. You look at any hackathon that's been run in the legal tech space in this country is primarily organised by the student bodies or in association with universities. And just anecdotally, just our own team, law graduates that picked that got the legal tech bug whilst at university. So they never went to law firms at all. So it's all kicked off at the university level. So plays a fundamental role. Seems to be gathering more pace, if anything, and quite a strong theme in the jurisdictions that we visited.
Something definitely to be celebrated, I think. It's amazing. And Nikki, your thoughts, I guess, on what's been said already about the impact of digital literacy on legal tech update, but also kind of how the role of collaborations, I guess, plays into that as well.
I think firms are recognizing, and in fact, corporate legal departments are recognizing the need for their lawyers to be more literate from a digital perspective. And so firms, for example, I think are gradually starting to actually hire people who have real change management skills and expertise to work with the lawyers to bring them on board new technology. Where previously it was just sort of an add-on to the end of the project. I think people are starting to be a bit more strategic about that. They're also starting to use programs that provide inline training for a lot of these tools, like WalkMe, that can be set up so that as you're using a solution, it's actually providing you with training and guidance in real time. And of course, firms are increasingly developing functions and departments around innovation where you have allied professionals working alongside lawyers to really help them adjust and come on board with the technology that's been brought on. But I have to say, I do think what David mentioned is really critical. I think it's much easier if all of that is introduced first at law school. So I'm really pleased to see that is a trend, that these types of courses are increasing. And in fact, I have to say, I am speaking to you now from a law school where I just taught a course on legal technology. So the more of us that are out there teaching, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think it's a continuum that's starting increasingly in primary school. Because, and if you think about it, to me, it's like, it's a knock-on effect that is kind of like a rock that, rolling down a hill. It's just gathering more and more in terms of expertise and expectations as well, in terms of the workplace. Sadly, I have to start wrapping us up. We've reflected on all of the things that we've learned or that we know, either through the series or otherwise to this point. So I just want to flip it a little bit now and look a little bit ahead. And so the question that I want to put to all of you, and Clinton, I'm going to come to you first on this one, is what's next for legal tech around the world in 2023? So you'll see I've not gone too far because we're only a month or so away from that. So in 2023, and if you see also in that a difference between the B2B market and the B2C market. So again, just picking up those threads that we've had through the course of this. So Clinton, first to you, but I want to come to all of you on this one.
Sure. Thinking back, as you've been speaking there, it occurred to me that I had a similar question probably a year and a half back, and my answer then was fully around data and collaboration, and in many senses. And I think that's actually still the same. I think those are the two greatest opportunity areas. Covering both of those, Legaltech UK have been running a number of things ecosystem-wise there, but one of the things was a multi-party data collaboration project. So connecting a series of law firms, regulated banks, that sort of thing. Privacy preserved data access across organisations, that sort of thing, just super interesting. But what that threw out was, one of the main questions with that sort of thing is actually the regulatory side of things, real uncertainty. I think interoperability is going to probably increase over the coming year. Part of that being environment driven, and opportunity sales driven as well. And then across the different parts of the ecosystem, I suspect the main growth is going to come from the corporate side of things, as opposed to law firms, with the best will in the world. And part of that is an exposure piece, which is still very, for the most part, very self-contained, as it were. The things will continue there with the functional outsourcing, the workflow related stuff. It's starting to get a sense that on the corporate side of things, the view seems to be moving further afield, outside of the workings of the department, particularly at GC level, that sort of side of things. So I suspect, perhaps it'll mean that there's a more blurred understanding of Legaltech as that develops, and starts embedding itself more in the broader business environment. And 2023, question mark whether that's the right time frame. But again, coming back to things like predictive analytics and routing nudges and behavioural prompts through to the root cause area.
Terrific.
Personally, I think really quite an exciting piece.
Fabulous. So the two big ones I'm going to take from that are data will yet again be or continue to be incredibly important, and maybe likely the corporations or the corporate side of things will continue to lead in the space. So Nikki, over to you on your thoughts about this. And as I say, not going too far, just next year so far.
Yeah, I will be quick. I think legal ops will continue to be on the rise. Corporate legal is recognizing they need legal ops. So we're going to see growth there, certification programs there. Agree with data, but I also think on the law firm side, increasingly law firms understand they need to be data driven. They're bringing external data in, marrying it with internal data to be able to really create a decision framework that is data driven. Service delivery between clients and firms, I think, will increasingly rely upon really good performance data provided by firms at the staunch request of clients. And I think we have seen an increase, certainly in the States, of subsidiaries, law firm subsidiaries. I think that will continue. I think what will also continue, though, is for firms that don't have subsidiaries, very strong relationships between law firm innovation departments and ALSPs who work together to solve client problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Or even expand increasingly into that role. Yeah, absolutely. David, we started with you, so it seems appropriate we should end with you as well. What are your thoughts on this one?
I think 2023 is still quite hard to go past the downturn in the tech sector. I think a lot of companies will start to maybe bunker down, get into survival mode potentially. So preserving that runway, making sure they keep their existing customers and renewals on track. not lose any customers, because it probably will be harder to acquire customers if spend is starting to be reduced at the corporate or law firm level. So I think if we do tip into recession, I think that's hard to escape that type of conclusion. But of course, there plenty of opportunity comes out of a crisis. We've seen a lot of job cuts in the broader tech sector amongst some of the star players in the tech sector. That sort of frees up some of the labour market. So if you're trying to recruit the best of the breed in developers, etc., or AI, artificial intelligence talent, those that might have been shaken out of some of those larger companies in Silicon Valley are now on the market and may be able to be snapped up by the less sexy legal tech companies around. And don't forget, plenty of transformative companies had come out of the dot-com crash and the aftermath, and also the 2008 financial crisis. So really transformative companies were built during those times. So it could be a time for real opportunity if we were to see a recession. And just broadly continuing on, I do think contracting tech will continue its current momentum and will do for 2023 as well.
So it sounds pretty positive to me, actually, 2023, in the face of, what could seem a little depressing almost in what we're hearing in the news at the moment. So lots to be done, still lots to be done, and lots of opportunities, with a cautionary tale in there, obviously, that we've discussed during the course of this. So incredibly grateful to you, David, Nikki, and Clinton, for your thoughts today and in bringing this series to a wrap. I know that folks may have other questions after this, and I know that all of you are open to folks reaching out to you. So you'll find them certainly on LinkedIn and a whole bunch of other places, their websites, etc. as well. So do please reach out and contact them. I'm going to really encourage you also to catch the replays of this series for the various regions and countries that you may have an interest in, or all of them, because we really did go into quite a lot of detail in each of these, and particularly if they're regions that you work in or you're interested in investing in. I think there's lots of really good information for you to jump into and to listen to. And this, this session has really been the highlights in many respects of what we kind of heard in all of those places. Just like today, I also want to recognise the faculty that contributed to the series. There were many people and they gave a lot of time, and we're incredibly grateful and appreciate that as well. And again, David, if I may end this session with a special thanks to you and in council, as it has been today with all of you and with you too, David. It has been an absolute pleasure to work with you. Thank you for your contribution
Likewise,
to the
Terri.
series.
Thank you so much.
So, folks, that's it. We've wrapped on time. Thank you very much again, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much.